When World War II ended, many of Adolf Hitler's top leaders were hunted down and put on trial. But what about the men who were always by his side, his personal bodyguards? These were the people who stood just a few steps away from him every day, followed him into meetings, and were with him in the bunker during his final hours. What happened to them after the war might surprise you. Some were captured by the Soviets and sent to harsh prison camps. Others were taken by the Americans and quietly released. A few ended up in court, and strangely, some went on to live fairly normal lives, writing books or giving interviews years later, sometimes still defending their role in history. This isn't just a story about soldiers, it's about what happens when the war is over and the world tries to deal with the people who protected one of history's most hated men. Hitler's personal bodyguards weren't just regular soldiers. They were hand-picked members of special units like the SS and the Führerbegleiter Kommando, FBK, chosen for their loyalty and willingness to protect him at all costs. Their job was to follow Hitler almost everywhere, watch for threats, and make sure he was safe, whether in public or inside his private bunker. Some of these men became well known after the war. Rochus Misch was one of the most famous. He worked as a phone operator and guard inside the Führer bunker and stayed with Hitler until the very end. Otto Gunsche was another close aide who helped carry out Hitler's final wishes after his death. Karl Wilhelm Krauss worked with Hitler earlier in the war, and Kurt Gildisch had been one of his early SS guards. Others like Ulrich Graf and Richard Schulze-Kossens played different roles, some as early protectors, others as officers trusted with sensitive tasks. These men weren't political leaders, but they were part of Hitler's inner circle, witnessing things few others saw. After the war, their connections to Hitler made them targets for investigators, but their stories didn't all end the same way. Some were punished, some released, and some went on to tell their side of the story. When the war ended, some of Hitler's bodyguards fell into the hands of the Soviet army, and their treatment was harsh. One of the most well-known cases is Rochus Misch. After Hitler's death, Misch tried to escape Berlin, but was captured by Soviet troops. He was taken to Moscow and spent about 9 years in Soviet prison camps. He described those years as brutal, surviving poor conditions and constant interrogations. He wasn't released until 1954. Another bodyguard, Kurt Gildisch, was also captured by the Soviets in Berlin. However, his story took a different path. He was released in 1946, but that wasn't the end of his troubles. Later, he was put on trial for taking part in the murder of a political opponent during the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The Soviets treated many of Hitler's inner circle as war criminals, even if they hadn't made political decisions. Being close to Hitler was reason enough for harsh punishment. Some were questioned for years, forced to reveal every detail of bunker life, Hitler's final moments, and Nazi secrets. While a few of these men survived their time in Soviet hands, they were never the same. The trauma and isolation left deep scars. Even after release, they often lived quiet lives, watched closely by authorities, and treated with suspicion. Their time as Hitler's protectors followed them for the rest of their lives. While some of Hitler's bodyguards ended up in Soviet hands, others were captured by American or British forces, and their treatment was very different. Instead of long, harsh prison terms, many were held for a short time and then released. One example is Karl Wilhelm Krauss, who worked closely with Hitler early in the war. He surrendered to American forces and was interned for about a year before being released in 1946. Afterward, he returned to civilian life, avoided politics, and even gave interviews later in life, describing Hitler as strict but polite. He never faced trial and lived quietly until his death. Another case is Richard Schulze-Kossens, a former SS officer and Hitler's adjutant. He was held by the Americans for 3 years, but never charged with war crimes. After his release, he became an author and wrote about his time in the SS. He lived a long life and died in 1988. These examples show how inconsistent post-war justice could be. In the West, if someone wasn't directly involved in planning the Holocaust or major war crimes, they often avoided serious punishment. Some historians say the Allies focused more on high-ranking political and military leaders than on personal staff like bodyguards. Still, these men couldn't escape their pasts entirely. Many were questioned, watched, and kept under suspicion for years. But compared to their peers in Soviet custody, their post-war lives were far less harsh. Some even managed to return to something close to normal. After World War II, the Allies launched a process called Denazification to remove Nazi influence from public life. Anyone who had worked closely with the Nazi regime was investigated, including Hitler's bodyguards. Some were brought to trial, but the results varied depending on their past actions. Ulrich Graf, one of Hitler's earliest bodyguards, had joined the Nazi Party in its early days and was deeply involved in its rise. After the war, he was sentenced to hard labor for his role in promoting Nazi ideology. He died in 1950, never regaining any kind of public life. Kurt Gildish, as mentioned earlier, faced a different kind of trial. He wasn't just punished for being a bodyguard. He was convicted for murder during the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. His 15-year sentence was one of the harsher punishments among Hitler's close protectors. Most of the others avoided trial or were released after short detentions. In many cases, the courts focused on direct involvement in crimes rather than proximity to Hitler himself. This led to mixed public reactions. Some saw it as justice, others as letting dangerous people off too easily. These trials and investigations showed how complicated post-war justice could be, especially when deciding who was simply following orders and who was truly responsible. In the decades after the war, some of Hitler's former bodyguards became unexpected public figures. The most famous was Rokas Misch, who spent years in silence after his release from a Soviet prison camp. But in his later years, he gave many interviews, appeared in documentaries, and even wrote a memoir about his time with Hitler. Misch described himself as just a soldier doing his job. He claimed he was not involved in politics or war crimes and insisted he had no regrets. His interviews often sparked anger, especially when he defended Hitler or denied knowing about the Holocaust. Still, media outlets kept calling on him for inside details of the bunker, and he became known as Hitler's last bodyguard. Films and documentaries also helped shape how the public remembered these men. The movie Downfall, which dramatizes Hitler's final days, includes characters based on real-life aides like Misch and Otto Gunsch. These portrayals added to the myth and fascination around the people closest to Hitler in his final moments. While some viewed their public appearances as historical insight, others saw them as a way to dodge accountability. Either way, the media helped keep their stories and the controversy alive long after the war had ended. Despite their ties to one of history's most infamous leaders, some of Hitler's former bodyguards went on to live surprising lives. A few found work in ordinary jobs, others wrote books, gave interviews, or even tried careers in art or design. Their post-war paths were often unexpected and sometimes shocking. For example, Rokas Misch lived quietly in Berlin for decades, running a small business and later becoming a kind of public witness to history. Even though he faced criticism for defending Hitler, he remained unrepentant until his death in 2013. His daughter, on the other hand, chose a very different path. She became involved in Jewish cultural causes, a clear break from her father's past. Some bodyguards, like Karl Wilhelm Krauss, simply disappeared into civilian life. Others stayed in touch with fellow veterans and tried to keep their memories of the war private. Very few expressed remorse or guilt, and many insisted they were just doing their duty. These post-war stories show how complex human behavior can be. Some men stayed loyal to their old beliefs, while others moved on in surprising ways. Their lives after the war reveal the strange ways people adjust when history ends and judgment begins. The bodyguards of Adolf Hitler lived through one of the darkest chapters in history, and what happened to them after the war reflects the confusion and complexity of post-war justice. Some were punished harshly by the Soviets. Others were quietly released by the Western Allies. A few faced trials, while others faded into civilian life with little notice. What makes their stories so shocking isn't just the range of outcomes. It's how some managed to return to everyday life, even after standing beside one of the world's most hated men. Their post-war lives raise tough questions about loyalty, responsibility, and forgiveness. Whether they were silent, defensive, or surprisingly outspoken, each of these men carried the weight of their past. Their stories remind us that history doesn't just end with war. It lingers in memories, in actions, and in the lives of those who lived it up close.